Hi folks, tonight we journey far back into an age of gods and monsters, a time when heroes were not born perfect, but forged in pain, in labor, and in fire. It was a world where the divine walked among mortals, and where the strongest of men still carried the weight of sorrow. This is the story of Hercules, son of Zeus, yet scorned by Hera, a man who bore impossible burdens and rose again and again. He was a killer of monsters, a savior of cities, a lover, a wanderer, a king, and a slave. His life was not simple glory. Every victory carried a cost, every labor a step deeper into suffering. But through his struggles, he became more than mortal. He became the very image of what it means to endure. So, before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what we do here, and we'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is right now for you. It's always fascinating to know how far these quiet stories reach. Now, take a deep breath, dim the lights, let the noise of the world fade, and let your imagination slowly open. Tonight, we step gently into the story of a man who suffered and ascended, the man the Greeks called Hercules and the Romans Hercules. Together, let us ease into his trials. Long before thunder roared in the name of Hercules, before his hands crushed monsters and his back bore the burdens of kingdoms, there was a woman, and there was a god. Alcmene was her name, a mortal queen, graceful, proud, her lineage noble, and her beauty radiant enough to stir the skies themselves. She lived in Thebes, alongside her husband Amphitryon, a warrior of great repute. But fate had already begun to twist the threads of her life into something stranger than myth. On Mount Olympus, Zeus sat upon his golden throne. His gaze drifted often to the realm of mortals, not from boredom, but from hunger, from desire, and from destiny. Zeus had heard whispers of Alcmene's virtue, a woman so loyal that not even the king of gods could sway her heart unless he took another form. And so Zeus waited until Amphitryon rode off to war. One night, Alcmene welcomed her husband home. He looked the same, he spoke the same, he touched her as her husband would, but it was not Amphitryon, it was Zeus, cloaked in illusion, stretching one night into three, as stars shifted slowly and time itself seemed to bend for the king of the heavens. That night, a child was conceived, not of man, but of thunder, a son whose fate would ripple across generations. Yet, the heavens do not stir without consequence. Hera, the wife of Zeus, had seen enough. She knew her husband's games, and this time she would not let the bastard child rise unchallenged. She descended to the Fates, to Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, the weavers of destiny, and whispered to them her command: "Let the child of Zeus never rule. Let another be born first." And so the prophecy changed. There had been a prophecy once. It spoke of a child of Zeus, born of the blood of Perseus, destined to rule over all those around him. That child should have been Heracles, but Hera, cunning and cruel, twisted fate with the help of Lucina, goddess of childbirth. She ordered Lucina to delay the birth of Alcmene's son, to sit outside her chamber with her legs crossed, fingers tightly clenched, muttering spells that bound the womb shut, hour after hour, pain after pain. And elsewhere, in the city of Mycenae, another child was born, Eurystheus, son of Sthenelus, weak, frightened and mewling. But he had one thing Heracles did not: timing. Because of Hera's interference, Eurystheus was born first, and the prophecy shifted like mist around stone. Now he was fated to rule, and Heracles, still unborn, became a pawn. Inside Alcmene's chamber, agony turned to despair. Her strength failed, her breath shortened. The child would not come. But among her servants, one was wise. Her name was Galanthis. She saw Lucina's strange behavior and guessed the truth. With a sharp mind and a bold lie, she cried out, "Rejoice! The child is born!" Startled, Lucina rose in shock, her spell broken, and in that single moment of surprise, the womb loosened, and Heracles came screaming into the world, strong, loud, alive. Galanthis had saved him, but Hera did not forget. She transformed the clever maid into a weasel, condemned to scurry in the shadows. And so, Heracles' story began, not with triumph, but with delay, manipulation, and divine spite. But Heracles was not alone. Alcmene had lain with her true husband Amphitryon too, on a different night, and in her womb 2 children grew, one born of man, the other born of God, Heracles and Iphicles. The difference between them was not clear at first. Both boys fed at the breast, both cried, both kicked and crawled and played, but Hera had not forgotten. One night, as the children lay in their cradle, she sent serpents to their chamber, great coiling vipers, their tongues hissing, eyes gleaming in the dark, their jaws wide open. The room was silent until Heracles stirred, only months old, and yet. The child sat up, he reached forward, and with infant fists he seized each serpent by the throat. He squeezed, and then the sound, bones snapping, hisses cut short, and the silence after. Servants rushed in. Alcmene gasped. Amphitryon stared in awe. There in the cradle, Heracles sat calmly, the dead snakes clenched in each tiny hand. Iphicles, meanwhile, had screamed in terror, proving once and for all which of the two bore divine blood. The omen was undeniable. The boy was not merely strong, he was blessed or cursed by Olympus. The years passed, and Heracles grew faster, broader, wilder than any child of Thebes. His appetite was enormous. His voice carried like thunder, his strength terrifying. Amphitryon, unsure of how to raise such a child, called forth the finest tutors in Greece. From Linus, he learned music. But Heracles lacked patience for the lyre and the delicate notes of melody. One day, angered by correction, he struck his teacher. The blow was fatal. Linus fell dead, and once again the child's power had crossed into tragedy. Though the act was ruled accidental, it left a stain upon the boy's name. And so, he was sent away, far from the court, far from polished halls. Heracles was placed in the care of warriors, charioteers, wrestlers and philosophers. From Castor, he learned warcraft and horsemanship. From Eurytus, archery. From Autolycus, wrestling and cunning. From Rhadamanthus, justice and law. But no lesson, no discipline could truly bind the chaos within him. Heracles learned quickly, fought fiercely, and laughed in the face of bruises. He ran faster than horses, threw javelins that split trees, lifted stones that oxen could not budge. He was still a boy, but he carried the weight of a god beneath his skin. And that weight was only beginning to stir. Even among kings and heroes, there was none quite like him. In the wild fields of youth, Heracles wrestled lions with bare arms and outran his tutors under the hot sun of Boeotia. His body became a temple of strength, but his spirit untamed. Yet the world did not fear him, not yet, for his name had not yet spilled into legend, and the storm of his destiny still lay ahead, hidden behind the veil of time. But the gods were already watching. In his sleep, Heracles would dream of distant mountains, dark labyrinths, golden creatures, the feel of chains around his wrists, and the taste of dust in his mouth. Dreams that smelled of labour, of pain, of prophecy. His strength, as it grew, cast long shadows across his days, shaping not only himself, but the fate of all who crossed his path. One day he stood at a crossroads, a place whispered of in old tales. There 2 women appeared before him. One was radiant, cloaked in silk and gold. Her name was Vice. She offered him a life of pleasure, wealth and ease. No struggle, no war, only comfort. The other was plain, weather-worn, her hands calloused. Her name was Virtue. She offered him pain, hardship, long years of toil, and glory that would echo through eternity. Heracles listened, then chose the harder road. That moment, though brief and often forgotten, marked the first true labour of his soul. For strength alone was not enough to bear the weight of his fate. He needed purpose, and that purpose had begun to take root. Word of Heracles spread beyond Thebes. Travellers whispered tales of the boy who crushed serpents, who killed with a single blow, who bent metal and wood with equal ease. Some called him a monster, others a saviour, but none yet understood what he was to become. And somewhere high upon Olympus, Hera watched in silence. Her hatred had not faded, her will had not broken. The child had survived her curse, had strangled her serpents, had grown into something unkillable, but she had not yet begun. If Heracles would not die, then he would suffer. If fate would not abandon him, then she would twist it. And so, as he stepped into manhood, strong and shining, Hera stepped into the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike at the heart of his peace, waiting for madness. And it would come. In the blink of an eye, it would come. The boy had become a man, broad-shouldered, golden-haired, a living force of nature. His feet were calloused by stone, his hands carved by battle. The blood of Zeus throbbed behind his eyes, and the heat of youth surged through his limbs like fire. Heracles had left behind the scrolls, the tutors, the wrappings of childhood. Now the world awaited, and the world was wild. Beyond the plains of Thebes, there was a range of shadowed hills. The men called it Cithaeron. There, beneath the cold grey sky, a lion had begun to stalk the shepherds. It came by night, jaws silent, claws dragging bodies into the dark. Goats disappeared. Herders were found torn apart, their blood soaked into the stones. No spear could pierce it, no trap could catch it, and the people feared that it was not merely a beast, but a curse. Hercules, now a young man, heard these cries. He felt no fear. With bow slung across his back, and only a club in hand carved from the heartwood of a wild olive tree, he set off toward the hills. For days he hunted, through bramble and mist. He followed the creature's trail, claw marks on bark, scattered bones in the dirt, distant echoes of low growls. At last, in a grove blackened by blood, he found it. The lion was massive, muscles rippled beneath its golden coat, its mane blew in the wind like flame, its eyes ancient, yellow and unblinking. They stood, man and beast, each the master of his own wilderness. And then the clash. The arrow flew first, but shattered on the lion's hide. The club came next, swinging with the fury of Olympus, but even wood could not break the beast. They wrestled, flesh against fur, sweat against blood, thunder echoing from Hercules' chest. Then, in a burst of raw power, Hercules leapt upon the lion's back, wrapping his arms around its throat, and squeezed. The roar choked, the beast buckled, and with one final twist, silence. When Hercules returned to the fields, he wore the lion's hide draped over his shoulders, the skull resting like a helmet upon his head. From that day on, he bore it always, not as a trophy, but as a second skin. Not far from there lived a king, Thespius of Thespia. He had 50 daughters, and no heir. When Hercules came to his court, still fresh with the blood of victory and fire in his eyes, the king welcomed him with open arms, and with a quiet wish. Night after night, Thespius sent one daughter after another to Hercules' bed. Some say it was done in secret, that the daughters came disguised, that Hercules, weary from the hunt, did not know. Others say he knew, and smiled. 50 nights passed, and when the moon had cycled through its quiet arc, 50 sons had been conceived, a generation born in fire and lion's blood, destined to scatter across Greece and beyond. Even in rest, Hercules sowed legends, but he did not linger. Glory was calling, louder than love, louder than peace, and so he left Thespiae, left the warmth of the daughters, the wine and the songs. He was not yet ready to be king. He was still chasing something. In Thebes, Hercules returned a hero. The lion of Cithaeron was dead, and his name had spread through the valleys like wind over wheat. As a reward, the grateful king of Thebes, Creon, offered him his daughter, Megara. She was noble, quiet-eyed, gentle of voice. Hercules, no longer a wandering flame, found comfort in her presence. They married, and the halls of Thebes echoed with celebration. Wine flowed, feasts stretched into the night, flowers were braided into hair, and songs were sung of peace, of union, and of strength tamed by love. Years passed. Children were born, sons with dark curls and strong legs. They played in the palace courtyards. They laughed and climbed onto their father's shoulders. Hercules built a home, He trained young soldiers, he worked the land, he offered his service to the gods. For the first time, the world was still, and Hercules smiled. But the gods do not love stillness for long, and Hera was not finished. It came like a storm that no one saw, no thunder, no wind, just a silence, and then a scream. Hercules, standing in his home, felt something shift in his mind. The air grew thick, his thoughts unsteady, the world twisted. He saw enemies where there were none, swords in the hands of his sons, poison in Megara's voice. He roared, and the roar shattered windows. Megara fled, holding the children. But he was faster. One by one, he struck, and struck. And when the haze cleared, when the light returned, the bodies lay before him. The blood was his family's, the silence was his own. He stood among the ruin, breath shallow, hands trembling, and then he wept. The madness had passed, but the damage remained. Hera, from Olympus, looked on. She had not killed the boy of Zeus. She had done something worse. She had turned his strength against himself. There was no trial. No king could sentence the son of Zeus. But Heracles needed no sentence. His guilt was its own chain. He could not stay, could not eat, could not sleep beneath the same roof. So he left, wandering with ash in his hair, barefoot, broken, eyes hollow. He walked for days, and then he came to Delphi. The oracle awaited, veiled in smoke and sacred air, the mouthpiece of Apollo. He knelt. He did not speak. He only waited, and from her lips came the decree: you shall serve the one you hate. You shall bow to the weak. You shall atone with labor. 10 tasks, 10 trials, 10 roads to redemption. And your master shall be Eurystheus. Heracles did not argue. He stood, nodded, and turned toward Tiryns, the city of Eurystheus, the cousin born too early, the king who should not have been. Heracles, the greatest of men, would now be his servant. But in this shame, the story truly begins, for it is not glory without burden, not strength without suffering, not a hero without his labours. The road to Tiryns was long, dry, and without welcome. Dust clung to Heracles' sandals, his cloak now ragged, his lion's hide faded by sun. He walked alone, not with the stride of a conqueror, but the heavy gait of a man sentenced to penance. And waiting at the end was Eurystheus. The king was no warrior. He ruled behind high walls and polished marble, his voice soft, his crown inherited, not earned. But the gods had chosen him, or rather, Hera had. When Heracles arrived, Eurystheus stepped back in fear. He had heard the stories of lions strangled, snakes crushed in the cradle, a man who could tear trees from the earth. And now this man stood before him, bowed by guilt, eyes dark, muscles tense. Eurystheus relished it. He saw in Hercules not a cousin, not a hero, but a weapon, one forged by Olympus and placed in his hand. And so the commands began. One by one they would be spoken, tasks beyond mortal comprehension, labours designed to destroy. Eurystheus did not expect Heracles to return, but Heracles was no longer seeking life or death. He was seeking redemption, and if the gods had written his story in pain, then pain would be his path. The first labour awaited, and far off, in the shadow of another mountain, a roar broke the morning sky, a roar not of man, but of something deeper, something ancient, something monstrous. Heracles turned his eyes toward it and walked forward. The throne of Eurystheus had barely cooled from his last decree when the first command was spoken. A lion, he said, not like the one Heracles had slain in Cithaeron, not a creature of flesh and blood alone, but a beast from nightmare, with skin no blade could pierce, no spear could wound. It had made its den in the hills of Nemea, devouring livestock, dragging shepherds into the darkness, leaving behind only bones, stripped and broken. No one returned from its lair. This was to be Heracles' first labour, and so, with nothing but his bow, his club, and the weight of his silence, Heracles walked toward Nemea to face the Nemean lion. The valley of Nemea was quiet when he arrived, no birdsong, no rustle of wind through the olive trees, just stillness, the kind that comes when nature holds its breath. Heracles followed the signs, deep claw marks on stone, shattered antlers left beside pools of dried blood, tracks as large as shields pressed into the dirt, and then the cave, a mouth in the side of a hill, black and gaping. He stepped inside. The air was damp, the walls narrow. He moved slowly, listening, sensing, breathing with the dark. Then, from the shadows, a low growl. The lion stepped forward, not with fear, but with dominion. Its fur shimmered like molten bronze. Its eyes glowed with gold. Its body thick with muscle. Its mane rose like a storm around its head. Heracles knocked an arrow and loosed. It struck true, but clattered off, falling uselessly to the ground. Another arrow, then another. Each bounced as if the beast were stone. The lion lunged. Heracles rolled aside. His club swung, thunder in the narrow cavern, but the club shattered on the lion's skull, splintering into fragments. Still, the beast came. Heracles had no weapon, so he did the only thing left. He grabbed the lion, his arms locking around its throat, hands gripping the base of its skull. They thrashed, bone against muscle, claw against flesh. The lion roared and writhed. Heracles held firm. His arms tightened tighter until the roaring stopped and the body went still. The cave fell silent again. Only Heracles' breathing remained. He skinned the beast not with a blade, but with its own claw. The hide was unlike any other, thick, unpierceable, almost divine. He draped it over his shoulders, and the head he wore as a helm. From that day forward, Heracles was never seen without it. More than armour, it became his shadow. His first labour was complete. But there was no celebration, only another command. The second labour would be darker still. Far to the south, in the swamplands of Lerna, a thing stirred, born of Typhon and Echidna, mother and father of monsters. The Hydra was no simple serpent. It had many heads, some say 7, others say 9, and some whisper of 100. Each time one head was severed, 2 more would grow. Its breath could rot flesh. Its blood was poison. Its lair sat beneath the blackened waters, surrounded by bones, tangled roots, and the stench of decay. Hercules did not go alone. He brought with him his nephew, Iolaus, young, loyal, and untested. They stood at the edge of the marsh, where the earth turned soft, and the air tasted bitter. Hercules stepped into the mire, club in hand, lion's hide drawn tight across his shoulders. The Hydra sensed him. It rose, a nest of necks writhing into the air, eyes burning like coals, fangs dripping venom. It struck first, fast, fanning its heads in all directions. Hercules dodged, rolled, leapt, smashing one skull, then another. Each time a head fell, but from each wound 2 more sprang. The Hydra grew stronger with every blow. Iolaus cried out from the edge, "Fire, of course, fire!" As Hercules fought, Iolaus lit torches, and with each fallen head he rushed forward, searing the stump, burning the flesh shut so nothing could grow. The swamp filled with smoke. The screams of the beast echoed like thunder. Then the final head. The central one, immortal. Hercules reached for his sword, but paused. Instead, he lifted a great stone and crushed the last head beneath its weight. The Hydra twitched once, then fell still. Hercules dipped his arrows into its blood. The tips hissed, soaked with poison. From that day on, every arrow he loosed carried death beyond death. He had earned a new kind of power, but Eurystheus claimed the labor invalid. He said Hercules had cheated, taken help from Iolaus. Still, the beast was dead, and the marsh silent. That was all that mattered. For the third labor, Hercules was told not to kill but to capture. A delicate task, one not of strength but of patience. In the high forests of Arcadia there lived a hind, a golden creature, sacred to Artemis. Its coat gleamed like sunlight on still water. Its hooves were swifter than any arrow, and its horns, of radiant gold, glowed in moonlight. No man had ever touched it. To kill it would bring the wrath of the goddess. To catch it seemed impossible, but Hercules followed the trail. For 1 year he pursued the creature, through forests and rivers, across mountains and valleys. At night he watched for glints of gold through the trees. At dawn he ran, tracking hoofprints barely pressed into frost. One morning, near the laden river, he saw her. The hind was drinking, unaware. Hercules moved silently. Then, in a blur, he loosed his net. The hind leapt, but too late. She was caught, but she did not fight. She did not cry. She only looked at him, and in that look there was calm and sorrow. Then Artemis came. The forest darkened. The wind ceased. The goddess appeared in light and fury. Hercules knelt. He did not beg. He only spoke, plainly, truthfully. He told her of his labors, of the curse, of the shame. Artemis listened. Then she nodded. He could take the hind if he promised to return her, and so he did. He brought her to Eurystheus, let the king see, then released her back into the forest untouched. Not every victory is won with blood. Some are earned in silence. Heracles thought he might rest, but the fourth labour waited, louder and far more dangerous. The next command dragged him north, to the wild peaks of Mount Erymanthos. There roamed a boar unlike any other, not some common forest creature, but a beast of legend, whose breath steamed in winter and whose tusks split bark like kindling. It trampled fields, crushed fences, scattered flocks. Villagers dared not enter the woods, even hunters kept their distance. Heracles was told not to slay it, but to bring it back alive. And so he journeyed through the frost-hardened hills, wind biting at his skin, snow settling in his beard. Along the way he stopped at the cave of Pholus, a wise centaur, friend to gods and mortals alike. Pholus welcomed him with warmth and food, and conversation that flickered gently like the fire between them. Heracles shared tales of his labours. Pholus, listening, grew curious. He wished to offer wine, but not just any wine. The centaurs, by ancient pact, kept sacred jars, sealed by Dionysus himself, aged for generations. Pholus hesitated, but Heracles asked. And with reluctant hands the seal was broken. The scent of the wine filled the cave, thick, sweet, and intoxicating. It drifted out on the breeze, and the other centaurs smelled it. From across the valleys and forests they came, hooves pounding like drums, cries ringing across the mountains. They burst into Pholus's home, wild with rage. How dare you open what was meant for all? They raised their weapons. Heracles stood, calm but ready. The fight was chaos. Hooves crashing against stone, arrows flashing through the cave mouth, wine staining the ground. Pholus fled into the shadows, and Heracles, surrounded, fought like the storm. He swung his club, loosed his poisoned arrows. Centaur after centaur fell, writhing, groaning. Their howls echoed for miles, but not all were enemies. Among them was Chiron, the wisest of all centaurs, immortal, teacher of heroes, kind beyond measure. He had come only to calm the fight, but in the confusion an arrow struck him. It pierced his leg, and though it did not kill him, for he could not die, the poison burned, pain without end. Heracles rushed to his side, but it was too late. The wound would never heal, and the curse of that moment would echo far beyond that cave. The battle had ended, but something darker had begun. The centaurs would never forget their harmony, shattered by spilled wine and spilled blood. Among those who survived was one named Nessus. He watched from the trees, bitterness coiling in his chest like a viper. In years to come, it would be Nessus who sealed Heracles' fate. But not yet, for now the boar still roamed. Heracles left Pholus, whose kindness would soon meet its own tragic end, and returned to the mountain. He tracked the beast through the snow, each step sinking deep, breath steaming in the frozen dawn. And then he saw it. A silhouette, massive and moving. The boar stood on a ridge, its tusks glinting like blades. Its eyes were red, its snout caked with ice and blood. With a roar it charged. Heracles leapt aside, snow flying from his heels. They danced across the slope, man and beast, muscles straining, snow torn, roars mixing with the howling wind. But Heracles waited, He knew the land, the ice, the rhythm. He lured the boar into deep drifts, where its hooves sank, where its legs floundered, and then, with a roar of his own, he leapt forward, wrestled the beast down, bound it in chains of bronze. The boar thrashed and bellowed, but it was caught. Hercules dragged it down the mountain, through forest, through snow, and when he arrived at Tiryns, covered in frost and sweat, he threw the beast at Eurystheus' feet. The king squealed in terror and hid inside a bronze jar. It would not be the last time, but Hercules said nothing. He only waited. Another task awaited, another beast, and this time it would take him deeper into myth and further into pain. The snow of Erymanthos still clung to his cloak, and yet Hercules did not rest. There was no pause between labours, no feast, no firelight, no warm hands to greet him, only the next command, only the next impossible task. And though Eurystheus sat trembling in his palace, hiding beneath polished floors and behind bronze jars, his voice still carried the weight of law. The king pointed westward now, to tangled woods and riverbanks where none dared linger. The next labour was not one spoken aloud by messengers, but whispered, almost in fear. Centaur lands, again. But this time, no wine, no cave, just names, Nessus, Chiron, and a fate not yet fulfilled. The centaurs had once been his kin, wild but not wicked, strange but not enemies. Now suspicion clouded their name, the wine had split them, as surely as sword and arrow. Pholus, dead by accident, Chiron, poisoned and in pain, the harmony of hoof and hilltop, broken. Heracles had not meant for it to happen, but meaning was a poor shield against consequence. Some wounds fester slowly, others echo forward, through years, through stories, until one day they reach a river, and a woman's scream. But that is not yet, for now, in the cracks of memory, another name lingered, Nessus. He had not joined the others in battle. He had watched, waited, remembered. Nessus, who would one day ferry Heracles' wife across the river Evenus. Nessus, whose hands would touch what they should not, and whose dying words would become the venom sown into a hero's doom. But that day had not yet come. The tales of Nessus were still whispers on the wind. Chiron, however, remained, ageless, noble, wounded. The arrow that struck him, tipped with the Hydra's blood, had brought him agony no centaur could bear, not even a god, and though immortal, Chiron longed for death. It was Heracles who, many years later, would help grant that mercy, trading Chiron's life for the release of Prometheus. But even in myth, mercy takes time, and Chiron's pain would last. The centaurs were scattered now, their songs quieted, the wine jars shattered, the forest paths weary, and Heracles walked alone once more, back to Eurystheus, back to the cold commands. But even now, with blood on his hands and beasts behind him, he had barely scratched the surface of his punishment. These labours were only the beginning. By now, Heracles had shed the skin of a man. He was something else, not quite god, not quite mortal, a creature of strength, wrapped in silence, burdened with memory, and driven forward by shame. Each labour had tested his power, but this next one would test his pride. In the land of Elis, under open sky and wind-swept hills, There stood a kingdom where filth was king. Augeas was his name, ruler of a rich pasture land, owner of the largest herds in all of Greece. 3,000 cattle roamed his fields. Sacred beasts, some said, a blessing from Helios himself. But in all his years, Augeas had never once cleaned their stables, not once. The dung piled high, year after year, forming hills of rot and reek, so foul that even the flies abandoned them. No man could endure the stench, no servant could make a dent in the mess, but Eurystheus, smiling now behind his bronze walls, issued the next command: clean the Augean stables, not in a month, not in a week, in a single day. Heracles said nothing, he only walked. When he arrived at the court of Augeas, the king laughed. "You clean this?" Heracles looked him in the eye. "I'll do it," he said, "but if I succeed in a single day, you give me 1/10 of your herds." Augeas smirked. It was a fool's bargain, he thought. He agreed, but Heracles did not pick up a shovel. He did not call for help. Instead, he walked to the river. 2 rivers to be exact, Alpheus and Peneus, winding peacefully through the countryside, untouched by dung or man. Heracles tore through the earth like a plough. He dug deep trenches, carved new channels with his bare hands. The ground split open, the rivers changed course, and the water, cold and swift, poured into the stables like a flood from Olympus. It swept through filth and bone, through hay and rot, washing clean in hours what no man could in a lifetime. By dusk, the stables glistened, the cows mooed, the flies returned, and Heracles stood at the gate, not tired, not dirty, but waiting. Augeas saw what had been done, and his smile vanished, but rather than honor the deal, he refused. He called Heracles a liar, a cheat. He claimed the rivers did the work, not the man. Heracles clenched his fists, but he did not strike. Instead, he left. The gods saw what Augeas had done, and in time, justice would come. But not from Heracles, not yet. For now another command waited, and this one came with wings. In Arcadia, near the dark waters of Lake Stymphalus, a different kind of monster nested, not lion, not serpent, but birds. They were sacred once, some said, devoted to Ares, the god of war, but they had turned cruel, their feathers sharp as blades, their beaks blood-stained. They flocked in great numbers, darkening the sky, piercing flesh, stripping fields bare. Men feared to leave their homes. Eurystheus commanded, "Drive them out." Heracles arrived in silence. He stood at the edge of the marshes, his bow in hand, but the trees were thick, the fog too dense. Every step into the reeds was met with rustling wings. He could not see them, he could not shoot, so he waited, and then help came. Athena, goddess of wisdom, appeared. In her hands, a rattle of bronze, forged by Hephaestus himself. She gave it to Heracles. He stood in the shallows and shook it. The sound split the silence, sharp and metallic, echoing across the lake. The birds rose, in panic, in swarms. Heracles aimed. One arrow after another sang through the air, each tipped with the Hydra's poison. Feathers fell, bodies dropped. The sky began to clear, and the few birds that remained fled westward, never to return. The marsh stilled once more, and Hercules, quiet, watchful, left the bronze rattle where it lay. The gods had helped him once, but the next task would offer no such mercy. Far across the sea, on the island of Crete, another beast waited. It had once been a gift from Poseidon, a bull, snow white, strong as storm tides, radiant as moonlight. King Minos was meant to sacrifice it, an offering to the god who ruled the seas, but Minos saw its beauty and refused. He kept it for himself. Poseidon, enraged, cursed the creature. It turned wild, uncontrollable. It shattered fields, overturned chariots, crushed orchards beneath its hooves. And Minos, too proud to admit defeat, sent no word for help. But the gods had long memories, and so the task passed to Hercules. He sailed across the Aegean, quiet, alone, his eyes fixed on the waves. When he reached Crete, Minos met him. The king, white-bearded and proud, scoffed. "If you can catch it," he said, "it's yours." And Hercules nodded. He found the bull in the hills beyond Knossos, grazing among the stones. It saw him and snorted, then it charged. The earth trembled. Hercules stood firm. At the last moment, he leapt aside, grabbed the bull by the horns, wrestled it to the ground. Muscle met muscle, rage met silence. But in the end, the beast tired. He bound its legs, calmed its breath, and sailed it back to Tiryns. Eurystheus, as always, shrank in terror. The bull was released and wandered free. Eventually, it reached the plains of Marathon. There, it would meet another hero, Theseus, and fall once more. But that is another tale. Hercules had no time for legend. He only had orders, and the next one smelled of blood. In the rugged lands of Thrace, where the wind howls sharp across the steppes, there lived a king named Diomedes. He was no ordinary monarch, a son of Ares, they said. War ran in his veins, and cruelty in his breath. Diomedes kept horses, 4 of them, not for battle, not for race, not for glory, but for fear. For he fed them not with hay or grain, but with flesh. Human flesh. Strangers, slaves, enemies, even his own subjects when they displeased him. The mares, wild-eyed, foaming, man-eating beasts, were kept chained with iron thicker than a man's thigh. They tore men limb from limb and devoured them with snapping jaws. It was to these Diomedes gave his name and his power. When Eurystheus gave the command, Hercules did not ask why. He set sail for Thrace. The sea was rough, the sky low and grey. When he arrived, he found the mares tethered to bronze posts, the ground beneath them soaked with old blood. They screamed and thrashed at the scent of him. Hercules said nothing. He went to the stables, broke the chains, and the mares, maddened by hunger, lunged. But Hercules was ready. He held their bridles with bare hands, wrestling them back, snapping ropes around their jaws. And then Diomedes came, tall, armoured, laughing. "Do you think you'll leave with what's mine?" The king drew his sword, and battle came again. The clash of man against man, blades ringing, hooves stamping, the sky above them roaring with thunder not yet summoned. Hercules struck him down, but he did not kill him at once. Instead, he dragged Diomedes to the mares and let him feed them himself. The horses fell upon their master, teeth flashing, blood spraying, until all that remained was silence. And with that silence came peace. The mares were calm now, their frenzy gone. Perhaps it was the flesh of their keeper that sated them, or perhaps they had seen strength unlike any other, and understood. Heracles led them away, and Eurystheus, ever afraid, begged for them to be taken far. In time the mares were released into the wilds of Mount Olympus itself, where no man would dare seek them again. By now the world knew his name. Heracles was no longer just a son of Zeus. He was a presence, a force, a shadow on the horizon, and wherever he passed, tales bloomed, cities rose, shrines were built where he had stopped to rest, springs were named where he had bathed, temples marked the paths of his footsteps, in Trachis, in Thebes, in Elis. Statues bore his likeness, prayers were whispered in his name, and cults began to form, not of the gods, but of the hero. They called him Sota, the saviour, the protector of travellers, the strength behind the plough, the fire in every man's struggle. These cults were not of Olympus, but of the earth. And as his labours continued, so too did the stories spread. Across islands, coasts and borders, no longer was Heracles a man performing penance. He was becoming something more, not yet divine, but no longer only human, a creature shaped by labour and on the edge of legend. The earth knew his name, but the sky was beginning to watch, and soon even the heavens would call. The labours had taken him through blood and darkness, through swamps and stables, through mountains and myths. But now, Eurystheus looked eastward, to a distant realm ruled not by kings, but by queens. On the shores of the Black Sea, where the rivers of Scythia meet the wild horizon, there lived a race of women unlike any in Greece, warriors, hunters, horse riders who needed no men to rule them, the Amazons, and among them stood Hippolyta, tall, fierce, crowned not by gold but by command. Her girdle, a simple belt to mortal eyes, was a gift from Ares himself, a symbol of her power, her authority, and her divine right to lead. Eurystheus wanted it, not for war, not for tribute, but as a gift for his daughter, and so Heracles sailed northward, across strange waters, into foreign lands where the Greek tongue was but a murmur among thundering hooves. When he arrived, he did not bring sword or shield. He brought only himself, and Hippolyta came to meet him. She had heard the stories of the man who strangled lions, who faced hydras and mares and bulls. She did not see an enemy, she saw an equal, and in their meeting there was peace. Heracles spoke plainly. He did not hide the task, and Hippolyta, amused, touched the belt around her waist. She agreed, willingly. There was no trickery, no challenge, only a quiet exchange between warriors. But peace does not please all gods. Hera saw what was unfolding, and she, who had shadowed Heracles since birth, who had twisted prophecy and poisoned his mind with madness, now took a darker shape. She walked among the Amazons in secret, cloaked in lies, and she whispered, Heracles is here to steal, to kidnap, to conquer. Panic bloomed. Swords were drawn, horns were sounded. The Amazon camp became a storm of rage and steel. Heracles saw the chaos and misunderstood. He thought Hippolyta had betrayed him, that her word had turned false. The battle was sudden, bloody. The Amazons, fierce and fearless, charged like wolves. But Heracles was Heracles. He fought with sorrow in his chest and fire in his limbs, and in the swirl of the clash, Hippolyta fell by his hand. The belt, stained with blood, was taken. The ship set sail, and Heracles, for all his strength, felt no victory, for what should have been a gift became a grave. The sea did not soothe him, and the next command would take him farther than any man had sailed before, to the edge of the world itself. Far in the west, beyond deserts and dunes, beyond lands where the moon sets red into the sea, there lived a creature named Geryon, a giant with 3 bodies joined at the waist, 6 arms, 3 grimacing faces. He dwelled on the Isle of Erythea, near the borders of night, and there he kept red cattle, sacred beasts guarded by a 2-headed dog named Orthrus and a herdsman named Eurytion. Eurystheus demanded these cattle, and so Heracles began his journey westward. He walked for weeks, through lands no Greek had named, through sands that burned the soles of his feet. He crossed Libyan dunes, where the sun showed no mercy, and somewhere in that long journey, Heracles grew angry, angry at the task, angry at the gods, angry at the heat, and he looked up at the sun. Then, in a fury few would dare, he pulled an arrow from his quiver and fired it into the sky. The arrow soared upward, a single silent defiance, and the sun, Helios, paused. He looked down, and he laughed, not in scorn, but in surprise. Never had a mortal dared such a gesture, and so Helios rewarded him. A golden cup, vast, radiant, floating upon the sea, appeared before Heracles. "Take it," the sun said. "It will carry you across the ocean," and Heracles climbed into it. The cup moved without oar or sail, gliding over the waters of Oceanus toward the edge of the world. There, on the island of Erythea, he stepped out. The red cattle grazed under the watch of Orthrus, the 2-headed dog, brother of Cerberus, offspring of monsters. It lunged. Heracles struck once, and it fell. Eurytion raised his spear. Heracles answered with an arrow, silent, swift. And then came Geryon, towering, grotesque, 3-faced and massive, his armor gleaming dark red beneath the fading sun. He shouted from 3 mouths, charged with 6 arms, but Heracles raised his bow, and with one poisoned arrow, just one, he pierced all 3 hearts. Geryon fell, his screams swallowed by the sea breeze. Heracles gathered the cattle, and with the golden cup returned east. The beasts lowed, the earth trembled, but the task was done, and as he stepped ashore, he paused. He placed 2 great pillars on either side of the strait he had crossed, one in Europe, one in Africa, to mark the edge of the world. The pillars of Heracles, a warning, a memory. a name etched into the bones of the earth. But even the edge of the world was not the end of his journey, because now the sky itself was stirring, the giants were rising, and Olympus would soon call for help. Far above the mortal world, the heavens trembled. The gods, once distant, aloof in their golden halls, now faced a threat that could shake Olympus from its roots. The Gigantes had risen, born of Gaia, mother of earth, sown from the blood of Uranus when he was cast down by Cronus. The giants were not just tall, they were elemental, titanic, born not of flesh alone, but of stone, fire, and hatred. They rose to overthrow the Olympians, to cast down the sky and raise chaos in its place. The war came like a storm. From the slopes of Mount Olympus to the shores of Thrace, the ground split, the stars dimmed, gods and giants clashed, thunder and ash, light and ruin, and in the chaos, a prophecy echoed. The gods could not win alone. No divine hand could kill the giants outright. They needed a mortal, one born of earth and Olympus both, one who had walked the line between heaven and suffering, one like Hercules. And so the call came, and Hercules answered. He stood alongside Athena and Zeus, shield to shield, lightning crashing overhead. The giants loomed, their hair wild, their eyes blazing. Each was a mountain wrapped in fury. Alcyoneus, the immortal one, who could not be slain while standing on the land of his birth. Heracles aimed his arrow. He loosed it, striking deep. The giant staggered, but did not fall. Athena, wise and swift, seized the moment. She lifted Heracles and carried him beyond the borders of the battlefield, far from the soil of Gaia. There, once removed from the source of his strength, Heracles struck again, and this time Alcyoneus fell. The earth groaned. One by one, the other giants came. Porphyrion, who sought Hera herself, roared and charged. Zeus struck with lightning. Heracles followed with an arrow to the heart. The sky lit with fire. Enceladus was buried beneath Sicily, crushed by Athena's stone. Others were cast into the sea, into volcanoes, into distant corners of the world. But always, Heracles was there, not just with strength, but with purpose. He had once fought to atone, now he fought to protect. Not for Eurystheus, not for himself, but for the balance of the world. And when the battle ended, when the giants had been silenced, even the gods looked at him, not as a tool, but as a hero. And the stars that night burned a little brighter, for now the sky was safe, but the labours were not yet done. There were still gates to open, still chains to break, and beneath the earth, a shadow waited. The years had carved him, his hands thick with scars, his eyes quiet, far-seeing, his steps slow but sure. The man who once wrestled lions with a roar now moved with the silence of someone who had seen too much, and lived. 9 labours had passed, and now only 2 remained, but they were not ordinary tasks. They were not of stables or beasts, not of birds or cattle. They were cosmic. They touched the edge of godhood and the roots of death. In the far west, beyond Libya, beyond ocean, there lay a hidden grove. There, in twilight lands where time itself seemed to slumber, stood a tree. Its leaves shimmered with silver, its apples glowed gold. They were gifts from Gaia to Hera, planted in celebration of her marriage to Zeus. Sacred, forbidden, eternal, and guarded by 3 sisters, the Hesperides, and by a dragon, coiled endlessly around the tree's roots, laid on with 100 heads, each whispering, hissing, watching. No thief had ever drawn close. Eurystheus wanted those apples, whether for glory or spite or some quiet dare. He sent Hercules to fetch them. No directions, no help, just the command. And so Hercules wandered. He crossed deserts where the heat spoke in tongues, climbed peaks that scraped the stars. In Libya he wrestled Antaeus, son of Gaia, who could not be defeated so long as his feet touched the earth. So Hercules lifted him and crushed him mid-air. In Egypt, the cruel king Busiris tried to sacrifice him. Hercules broke his chains and shattered the altar, and still he searched until he found Prometheus. On the cliffs of the Caucasus, chained to a rock, arms stretched wide, was a figure of agony. Prometheus, the Titan who had gifted fire to mankind, punished by Zeus for his rebellion. Each day an eagle came, tore at his flesh, devoured his liver. Each night the wound healed, and the pain began again. Hercules watched in silence, then drew his bow. One arrow, swift, true. The eagle fell, its scream echoing across the sky. Hercules climbed the rock and broke the chains. Prometheus, gaunt, bloodied, but grateful, looked into his eyes. "You will suffer more than I," he said, "but you will also be raised higher." And then he spoke of the apples. "Seek Atlas," he whispered. "He knows the way." Atlas, the Titan who held up the sky, a punishment from Zeus, a burden eternal. Hercules found him at the edge of the world, muscles trembling, back arched beneath the dome of heaven. "I need the apples," Hercules said. Atlas groaned. "I can get them, but only if you take my place." Hercules nodded. He stepped forward, and the sky was heavy. It pressed into his bones, his spine, his soul. Atlas disappeared. Time passed, perhaps hours, perhaps days. Then the Titan returned, golden fruit in hand. But Atlas smiled. "I think I'll leave you here," he said. "You hold the sky now. I am free." Hercules smiled back. "Very well," he said. "But before you go, would you take it back just for a moment, so I can adjust the cloak on my shoulders?" Atlas, proud but not clever, agreed. He lifted the heavens again, and Hercules picked up the apples and walked away. The fruit, bright, humming with divine power, was carried back across the world. But Hercules did not keep them. They were too sacred. Athena herself took them and returned them to the grove. Even a hero could not possess what belonged to the gods, but Eurystheus had seen them. And so, the 11th labor was done. Only one remained, and it led into death. The 12th and final task was spoken in a whisper. "Bring me the hound of Hades, Cerberus, the three-headed dog, guardian of the underworld, slayer of souls." To reach him, Hercules would have to descend, not metaphorically, not in symbol, but truly. into the land of the dead. No mortal had done so and returned, and so Heracles first sought initiation. At Eleusis he underwent the sacred rites, the mysteries of Demeter and Persephone, rituals that taught men to walk the threshold between life and death. Only after the cleansing did he descend, through caverns deep, through cracks in the earth where light dared not follow, down into the underworld, and the shadows opened. The underworld was not fire, it was not chaos, it was silence. A silence so thick it wrapped around the skin, pressed into the bones, and slowed the heart. Heracles walked alone. The torches flickered dim. The walls pulsed with a breathless stillness. He passed rivers, Acheron, Styx, Lethe, watched shades drift by pale and voiceless, not screaming, not weeping, just watching. In this realm, memory thinned, names faded, only the soul remained, and at its edge stood a gate not made of wood or iron, but of shadow and will, and before it, Cerberus. The hound was enormous, 3 heads, each snarling, each breathing a slow, smoky growl. Its body was coiled muscle, fur black as oil, eyes burning red. Snakes slithered from its neck and back, its tail writhed with a life of its own. No blade would pass here, no poisoned arrow, and Heracles knew he had come to wrestle it. But he did not charge. He walked slowly, arms open. He spoke to the beast, not in words, but in presence. The air trembled, and then he lunged. The battle was thunder and shadow. Heracles gripped the beast's throats, holding back snapping jaws, ducking venomous strikes from its tail. Cerberus bucked and thrashed, its claws ripped stone, but Heracles held on. He tightened his grip tighter until the beast gave way, not in pain, but in submission. Cerberus was not defeated, only calmed, and with slow, trembling steps, Heracles led him up, through the gate, through the caverns, back into the light. When they reached the world again, the hound howled, and Eurystheus, seeing the creature, fled once more into his jar. The 12th labour was complete, and Heracles had returned from death. But something else had happened below. While in the underworld, Heracles had not walked blindly. He had seen faces, old ones, familiar. Theseus, once a friend, now trapped in shadow, a prisoner of his own pride. Heracles reached for him, lifted him up, and freed him from his stone-bound fate. Others passed in silence, until he met Meleager, the hero of Calydon, once beloved, now ash. They sat, spoke, and Meleager, wrapped in ghost light, told him of a sister, not by blood, but by fate. Her name was Deianira, and Meleager's words lingered. "There is more to your story," he said. "More than labours, more than kings. There is love yet to come, and with it, ruin." Heracles nodded, and when he rose from the dead, he carried that name with him, Deianira, a name that would bloom in his future, like a flower of fire. He had wrestled the dog of the underworld. He had eaten with ghosts. He had stood in the land where all men fall, and walked back out, 12 labours complete, his sentence fulfilled. But destiny was not done. There were no more labours, but there was still pain, still betrayal, still a fire yet to burn, and Hercules would soon walk into it, into 12 labours behind him. And still Hercules walked with burden. He was a hero in the eyes of men, but in his heart there was no peace. He had seen the underworld, he had faced his shadow, and yet fate had saved its sharpest blade for the quietest hours, when his sword was sheathed, after the labours, after the gods had turned their eyes elsewhere. Hercules wandered north, to Calydon. There the halls of King Oeneus echoed with the laughter of a woman who would change everything. Deianira. She was not meek, not wide-eyed or soft-spoken. She had grown beside warriors. She had watched her brother Meleager fall in fire and glory. She knew the price of strength and the quiet dignity of sorrow. When Hercules saw her, he did not boast. He stood still. Something in her steadiness held him, but she was not unclaimed. Hercules, the river god, had come for her hand. A being of water, changeable, eternal, prideful. He could shape-shift at will, become serpent, bull, or flood. And when Hercules asked for her hand, Hercules challenged him. The court gathered. The river god approached in the shape of a man, tall, draped in flowing foam. They circled. Then the clash. Hercules struck first, shifting into a snake, hissing, lashing out with coiled fangs. Hercules grabbed the neck, crushed it back. Then came the bull, horns low, hooves pounding. Hercules gripped those horns, wrestled the beast, twisted, and tore one clean off. Hercules fled, the river foaming in retreat. The horn, still dripping, would later become a symbol of bounty, the cornucopia. But in that moment, it was a gift of victory, and Deianira became his bride. They left Calydon together, travelled through forests and winding rivers, hand in hand. She did not fear him. She saw the man beneath the lion's hide, and Hercules allowed himself to hope. For once, he could be more than a weapon. He could be a husband. He could be whole. But fate does not forget, and in the folds of that journey, a figure from the past returned. They came to a river, wide, cold, rushing with mountain melt, no bridge, no boat, but there, waiting on the opposite bank, stood Nessus, the centaur, once among the scattered kind who survived Heracles' earlier wrath. Now a ferryman, he offered help. "I will carry the lady," he said. "Let the hero swim." Heracles agreed. He waded into the river, powerful arms parting the current, pushing through the weight of water. Behind him, Nessus stepped into the shallows with Deianira on his back. But midstream, he turned, his voice sharpened, his grip tightened, and Deianira cried out. From the other shore, Heracles turned, saw, heard, and without hesitation, raised his bow. The arrow flew. It struck Nessus clean. The poison of the Hydra, still clinging to its tip, worked swiftly. Nessus collapsed, gasping, clutching his wound, but in his final moments, his eyes burned with vengeance. He turned to Deianira, his voice soft, kind. "Take my blood," he said. "Soak a tunic in it. If your husband ever strays, it will bind his love to you forever." Then he died. Deianira, shaken, trembling, remembered those words and kept the blood. Love is not always born from trust. Sometimes it is born from fear of losing, and in that fear, tragedy takes root. Years passed. Heracles, never still, journeyed across lands again. He conquered Oechalia, took its king, took its crown, and from that ruined court came Iole, young, radiant, quiet. She reminded Heracles of something he had forgotten, a softness he thought he no longer needed, and Deianira, waiting in the valley below, heard whispers of the girl, of her husband's gaze, and the blood of Nessus called to her. She soaked a tunic in it, just as the centaur had said, folded it, pressed it with care, sent it to Heracles as a gift, a gesture of love and fear. He received it with warmth, unfolded the cloth, and wrapped it around his body. At first, nothing, then a heat, not of sun or fire, but of skin splitting, of veins boiling. The tunic clung to his flesh, it melted into him. He screamed, a sound not of rage but of pain, unbearable, deep, endless. He clawed at the cloth, but it tore away muscle. He fell to the ground, writhing. His men ran, some wept, others could not bear to look, but Heracles did not beg. Through gritted teeth, he called for silence. Then, through blistered lips, he ordered a pyre. On Mount Oeta, high above the clouds, he climbed limb by limb, each step a trial greater than any labour. He built the wood himself, gathered logs with bloodied hands, laid atop it, and waited, but none dared light it. None but one, Philoctetes, a boy, brave, pure of heart. He stepped forward, torch in hand, and at Heracles' nod, he lit the fire. The flames rose, gold, red, white. They wrapped around the lion's hide, the poisoned flesh, the suffering, and then Heracles was gone. The flames licked the sky. They rose, like wings of pain turning into light. The pyre on Mount Oeta crackled and roared, not with death, but with something else, something final. Heracles did not scream, he did not writhe, he lay still, eyes open, watching the smoke rise, as if he were waiting for something beyond the pain. And above, the gods stirred. They had watched him from afar, through labour, through madness, through love and ruin, but now they looked closer. He had gone beyond what any mortal had endured. He had faced monsters of flesh and monsters of the heart. He had served not only gods, but people. He had bled for peace, bled for justice, and now he burned. Not in punishment, but in transformation. A silence fell over the mountain, and then a light descended. Not fire, not thunder, but divine brilliance. Zeus himself descended in the hush of smoke and embers, his voice not loud, not cruel, but proud, and with a wave of his hand the mortal skin was lifted, the pain stripped away, the agony of the poisoned tunic faded into dust, and from the pyre rose a figure reborn, no longer mortal, no longer burdened. Heracles, son of Zeus, ascended. The smoke curled gently into the air, not like fire-devouring wood, but like spirit unbinding from flesh. On the slopes of Mount Oeta, the crackle of the pyre faded until there was only ash and silence. But that silence did not mark the end, for Hercules had never been just a man. He had walked with gods, laboured under curses, loved, lost, bled and burned, and through each trial something deeper had been kindling inside him, not just strength, but divinity. From the heights of Olympus, Zeus watched the smoke rise, a father, yes, but distant for too long. He had sired Hercules, but left him to fate. Now, as the flames consumed the mortal shell, Zeus stirred. He gathered the winds, he opened the skies, and he descended, not in wrath, but in stillness. He came to Mount Oeta not with thunder in his hands, but with light in his breath. The pyre flickered once more, then faded, and from the embers Zeus lifted what remained, not charred bones, not ruined skin, but the soul of a hero, shining, vast, and weightless. He raised it into the heavens, where pain could no longer follow, and with that single act, the mortal was left behind, and Hercules became divine. He passed upward, through clouds woven with gold, through layers of starlight, through winds that whispered the names of every hero who had ever lived. And at the gates of Olympus, the gods turned. They watched him enter, not as a guest, not as a servant, but as one of their own. And Hera stood waiting, the one who had opposed him at every turn, who sent madness to his mind, who placed serpents in his cradle, who turned his labours into torment, now stood silent. Their eyes met, and Hercules did not speak. But Zeus approached. He placed his hand upon Hera's shoulder. He did not command. He asked, and something in her gaze, so long cold, softened. She looked at Hercules and offered peace, a rare gesture in all of Olympus. And more than that, she offered family. For Hera gave him her daughter, Hebe, the goddess of eternal youth, gentle, bright, ever smiling. In that marriage, the old wounds were closed, not erased, but healed. The boy born of seduction and storm was now the son-in-law of Olympus' queen, and peace, at last, held. He took his place among the immortals, no longer wrapped in lion's hide, but in light, no longer burdened with chains or guilt, but lifted by laughter and song. He sat at the feasts of the gods, drank ambrosia from cups carved by Hephaestus himself. His hands, once weapons of war, now held joy, and with Hebe he fathered twin sons, Alexiares, he who wards off war, and Anicetus, he who is unconquerable. Together they stood for strength without cruelty, power without pride, the legacy of a man who had once known both. The stars watched, and down below, mortals still whispered his name in every city he had passed, in every path he had cleared, in every boy who lifted a stone or stood up against a tyrant. There echoed the story of Hercules, but here, in the halls of Olympus, the hero finally rested. His voice softened, his shoulders lightened, and for the first time in an eternity, he smiled. Not because he had survived, but because he no longer needed to. There was no lion to kill, no serpent to burn, no gate to break through, only peace, the kind that does not roar, but hums, gently, like a low wind passing through golden halls. In Olympus, Hercules did not forget the world below, but he no longer carried its weight. He had done his part. He had lifted what others could not just stones and mountains, but the sorrow of guilt, the agony of betrayal, the labour of living. And now he lived not as penance, but as legend. The gods honoured him. He joined them in their councils, not as a subject, but as a peer. He laughed with Hermes, drank beside Dionysus, trained with Ares, and walked beneath stars with Apollo. But it was beside Hebe that his peace found shape. In her there was no struggle, only renewal. She soothed the fire in him, and in their sons he saw not his labours, but his legacy. Alexiaris and Anicetus would never know stables filled with rot. They would not wrestle monsters, or wear a poisoned tunic. They would know Olympus. They would know honour. And in that, Heracles smiled again, because strength had finally passed into stillness. Far below, temples rose in his name, not by decree, but by love. Men carved his figure in stone, broad, bowed, eternal. They lit fires at dusk and whispered prayers into smoke. They asked not just for victory, but for endurance. They asked not just for might, but for mercy, because Heracles had shown the world that to fall and rise again, to suffer and still carry others, was the truest labour of all. And somewhere beyond the veil of sky, where gods walk in golden sandals and heroes shine without shadow, Heracles walks still, not in war but in quiet. The lions hide at his back, the stars above his brow, and the peace he earned in every breath. Even gods are made of many faces, and Heracles, perhaps more than any, he was not only the slayer of monsters, not only the builder of legends, he was contradiction itself, a man who broke chains and sometimes wore them. He was divine and yet coarse, tender then cruel, a protector of peace who brought destruction in his wake, and across the lands he touched, mortals remembered him not as one figure, but as many. There are parts of the world where Heracles' hands never drew blood, but laid stone. In Arcadia, in Boeotia, in Thessaly, his feet passed, and where they did, people built, not in fear, but in honour. He taught them how to measure land, how to divide rivers, how to bring order to the wilderness. Some say he invented laws for wandering tribes, settled feuds with nothing but his presence, in Egypt, Libya, even Italy. Altars rose where once there was only sand. He showed them fire, not as Prometheus did, stolen in defiance, but wielded with restraint. He founded shrines where no gods had yet spoken. Temples bearing his name appeared beside springs he drank from, trees he rested beneath. They worshipped not just his strength, but his journey. For in him they saw the struggle of man, and the guidance of something more. To some he was Sota, saviour. To others Kalinikos, the glorious victor. He was invoked at city gates, at wrestling grounds, at harvest festivals, not because he was perfect, but because he was not. And still, he rose. But the same hand that built could also break. Strength, untempered, becomes fire in dry grass. Heracles was not always noble. His temper burned fast and left ash behind. There were moments, dark, unspoken, when his rage did not fall on monsters, but on men. He had killed his music tutor as a boy, but even as a man, the line between hero and destroyer often blurred. He killed Iphitus, a guest under his roof, throwing him from the city walls in a moment of fury. He razed cities that offered insult, defiled sacred spaces in pursuit of vengeance. When denied the hand of Iole, he returned with fire and war, and at Delphi, in madness or anger, he seized the sacred tripod of Apollo, tried to make his own oracle. The gods intervened. Zeus hurled a thunderbolt between him and Apollo, and only then did Heracles step back. These were not the tales carved in temple stone, but they whispered through generations, like smoke under doors, because even the strongest hands can tremble. And still, he loved. Oh, how he loved. For all his violence, Heracles was no stranger to tenderness. His heart, heavy, wounded, still reached for warmth where it could find it. Megara, his first wife, the woman whose children he cradled, then lost in madness. Her memory lived behind every pause in his laughter. Deianira, his second wife, whose name became tangled in both love and poison. He wrestled a river god to win her hand, and her final gift brought about his death. Iole, the girl whose presence reopened old wounds. He did not resist her beauty, but it cost him the trust of Deianira. Hylas, the boy he loved. Young, soft-eyed, brave. Lost to the waters during the Argonaut's voyage, pulled beneath by naiads, never to be seen again, Heracles searched, wept. He left the expedition in grief, and then, Omphale, the Lydian queen, to her. Heracles was sold as punishment. He wore women's clothes in her court, spun wool beside her handmaidens, while she wore his lion's skin. Some mocked him, but Heracles did not flinch. He served. And in that strange reversal, he found something few heroes ever did: humility. His lovers, male and female, were not footnotes. They were windows into his wounds, into his need to be known, not as a god, but as a man. There are men born into servitude, and there are kings born of conquest, But Heracles was both. His life was a pendulum. At one moment, kneeling before Eurystheus, performing labours like a slave. The next, storming gates, toppling monarchs, founding dynasties. He was sold into bondage for spilling sacred blood, and yet he ruled over lands that stretched from the Aegean to the riverbanks of Illyria. In Lydia, he served Omphale, not only in name but in posture. He bore the yoke of discipline, not imposed by chains, but by humiliation. She dressed him in silk, laughed at his strength, and Heracles did not resist, because somewhere beneath the lion's pelt, the weapons, the fires and the songs, he longed for surrender, to be still, to be quiet, to not lead, not conquer, not atone, but simply exist, and yet fate would not allow it. Soon he cast off the veil of submission and rose again. He conquered Troy, defended Thebes, shattered kingdoms that defied the will of the gods. He became, in moments, the very force he once served. He could walk into a palace and bend rulers to his cause, or enter a village and help dig irrigation with his bare hands. He was crowned, then cast down. He ruled, then wandered, because Heracles could never be contained in just one form. He was not built for thrones, nor for chains. He was a vessel for the extremes, of strength, of grief, of desire, and perhaps that is why the world remembered him, not as a paragon, but as a mirror of what we all carry. He was a builder, a destroyer, a lover, a monster, a sun, a fire, a storm, and still a man. A man who became myth, a myth who became God, and a God who never stopped walking. The flames of his pyre had risen into heaven, but the footprints Heracles left behind remained in dust, in stone, in memory. He had lived, suffered and risen in Greece, but his shadow travelled farther, across continents, across tongues, into temples he never walked, and stories he never told, because heroes do not stay still. Their stories migrate, and Heracles, more than any, became a traveller not only in body, but in myth. He crossed the Ionian Sea long after his death, not in flesh, but in name. The Greeks brought him to Italy, and there he changed. In Etruria, in Rome, his name shifted from Heracles to Hercules, and he grew louder, sharper, more armoured. In Rome, he was no longer the flawed labourer atoning for madness. He was a general, a conqueror, a god who walked among men and raised cities from dirt. They built temples for Hercules Invictus, Hercules the Unconquered. He stood at the gates of Roman armies. He guarded the traders of the Forum Boarium. He became the model for the Via, the Roman ideal of strength, courage and control. Even emperors wore lion hides in his honour. They raised arches and minted coins with his image, bow in one hand, club in the other. But Rome was not the only land to claim him. In Phoenicia, in the great port city of Tyre, he was known as Melkart, a god of the hunt, of fire, of the sea's edge. They built flame altars for him. And in Carthage, the daughter of Tyre, his name echoed in new prayers. In Egypt, he entered through the mouths of traders and priests. There he blended with Shu, the god of strength and space. He was worshipped beneath palm trees and stone columns. In every land he touched, he was translated, not just in language, but in spirit. Some saw him as a guide, some as a storm. Some carved his image to protect their gates, others invoked his name to bless their dead. The farther his story travelled, the more it changed, but at its core, one truth remained. Here was a man who bore unbearable weight and did not fall. In Greece, his worship had begun even before his death, but after his ascension, it blossomed. Hero cults rose in every region he had touched, not merely temples, but sacred places of memory. In Thebes, his birthplace, the altars stood where he had once drawn his first breath. In Olympia, athletes prayed to him before the games, not to win, but to endure. They offered wreaths, oaths, small statues carved in clay. In Boeotia, they sang hymns for him during festival days. In Trachis, women left offerings at his tomb. He was not a distant god. He was close, intimate. They called him Kalinikos, beautiful in victory. They called him Promachos, the one who fights in front. He was the protector of wrestlers, of travellers, of weary men seeking strength. Some cults kept his myths alive through sacred plays. Others passed them on in whispers at campfires. Children played games with lion masks on their heads. Elders traced his labours on pottery and walls. He was everywhere, not as a perfect deity, but as the one who struggled and still rose. His cult was not cold or grand, it was warm, like a hand on your shoulder before battle, like a story told before sleep. Hercules was not only remembered, he was kept. Before the temples, before the statues, before the altars heavy with fruit and fire, there were stories, told in verse, told by the voice of the old and echoed by the dreams of the young. Hercules lived in the mouths of poets long before his image took shape in stone. In Homer, he is a shadow, a name spoken with weight, a ghost in the underworld, broad and silent, the man who shook the world with his strength, yet whose pain never left him. In Hesiod, he is more fully formed, a champion, a boundary breaker, but always hunted by Hera, always driven by necessity. Then came the tragedians. In Euripides, Heracles is not just muscle and myth, he is mind, a man tormented by fate, a father who kills his children not in war, but in madness, a figure who returns to the stage not with glory, but in chains. He collapses, weeps, curses the gods, and the audience does not cheer. They grieve with him, because here was something raw, something painfully human. Sophocles too invoked him, the unreachable strength that heroes measure themselves against. And in comedy, he becomes exaggerated, loud, bumbling in his appetites, not mocked, but magnified, as though his very legend had grown too large for the stage. And then came Rome, Virgil, Ovid, Seneca. In their hands, Hercules became a symbol of Roman will, brutal, efficient, victorious. They stripped away the shame and left only triumph. But even then, beneath the armor, the lion skin, the sculpted jaw, the story remained. A man burned by the world, carrying the impossible, and walking forward anyway. In statues, he leans on his club, weary. In mosaics, he grapples lions, bends trees, lifts worlds. In coins, his face wears a quiet fatigue. In every form, he endures. Through verse, through marble, through memory. Hercules crossed the centuries not as a god untouched by sorrow, but as a man carved by it. He was sung in lullabies, praised in oaths, feared in warning, and somewhere, in every culture that found him, there lived the quiet recognition that to fight, to fall, and to rise again is the labour we all share. The gods may fade, the temples may crumble, the marble may weather and fall, but stories remain, and among them Hercules endures, not just in the echoes of war, not just in the roar of battle, but in the quiet spaces between, in the places where pain lingers, where choices cut deep, where strength alone is never enough. Hercules lives there, not just as a hero, but as a question. What makes a hero? In the world of myth, a hero is not simply strong. Strength without virtue is a beast, and virtue without trial is a dream. Hercules was both. He was not kind, always. He was not gentle. He was not clean of guilt or sin or madness. And yet, the Greeks did not turn from him. They crowned him, because in Hercules they saw the truest face of the heroic paradox, a man who suffers and grows through that suffering, a man whose greatness is born not despite his wounds, but through them. He is the hero who kills his children and then atones, the hero who topples kings and then bows to a lesser man, the hero who carries a lion's strength and yet can still be undone by the softness of a wife's touch, a woman's grief, a poisoned cloth. The Greeks did not love him for his perfection. They loved him because he broke, because he bled, because he fell, and still rose again. Look closely, and you'll see that every triumph of Hercules is shadowed by loss. He slays the Hydra, but only with help, and is denied credit. He cleans the Argean stables, and is cheated. He wins Deianira, and is destroyed by her love. Even his apotheosis, his godhood, only comes after fire, after the agony of burning flesh, the roar of poisoned blood, and the stillness of a pyre on a mountain top. Hercules never rests for long. Peace is fleeting. Every moment of quiet is the breath before the next tragedy. He is the hero who cannot stop, because once he does, he must face himself. And so he moves, always, as if motion could erase memory, as if glory could silence grief. But it never does, and perhaps that is why he remains beloved, because even gods can't outrun sorrow, and Hercules never pretended to. Strip away the bow, the lion's hide, the labours, the names, and what remains? A man caught between two worlds, divine and doomed, merciful and monstrous, saviour and destroyer. He is not clean, he is not pure, but he is real, a reflection of all the contradictions we carry. We try to be strong, but we hurt those we love. We seek purpose, but stumble into madness. We build, we break, we burn, and still hope to rise. Hercules is not above us. He is beside us. He is what we are at our highest and at our lowest. And in that, he is not just the greatest of Greek heroes. He is the most human of them all. There are names that vanish, washed away by tide, by dust, by silence, and then there are names like his, Hercules, carved in the bedrock of memory. He shaped more than myth. He shaped the very idea of what it means to be strong, of what it means to be broken and still rise. Kings built temples for him. Warriors prayed in his name before the clash. Poets sang of his labours when the wind turned cold. And across ages, across continents, the tale passed from tongue to tongue, from father to son, from firelight to screen. He became a pattern, a map, a symbol reborn. In Rome, he was called Hercules, not the haunted hero of Greek sorrow, but the triumphant conqueror, clad in bronze, fierce and untouchable. In medieval tales, he became a giant slayer, a moral tale. In Renaissance paintings, a subject of power, virtue, idealized flesh. And in modern times, he walks again on movie screens, in novels, in comic books, broad-shouldered, unyielding, sometimes smiling, sometimes roaring, always enduring. But with every retelling, something changes. The monsters become metaphors, the labours symbolic. The man behind the myth grows harder to see, yet still, even now, when someone speaks of inner strength, of impossible burdens, of rising from ruin, we remember him, not by name always, but by feeling, that pulse in the chest, that quiet voice that says, keep going. In every trial, a path to transcendence. The labours were never just about beasts or blood. They were about the climb, the fall, the climb again. They were about cleansing the soul, not just the stables. About mastering rage, not just the bore. About learning how to carry guilt, to shoulder loss, to find light in darkness. Hercules didn't become a god because he won. He became a god because he suffered and chose to continue, because he was torn down and chose to rise. In the end, Hercules was never just the son of Zeus. He was something older than myth, something deeper than bronze and marble. He was the voice in every broken man that whispers, "Get up." He was the silence after every trial that asks, "Now, who will you become?" To be human is to struggle. To be divine is to endure. And Hercules was both.